The reason why there are so many different forms of Buddhism is because just before Buddha died, at that time, he had a large range of followers. And so when he had this large range of followers, the people who were following said, well, what happens now? You're going to die. Who's going to take care of us? Who's going to lead us on this spiritual path? And essentially what the Buddha said is he said, you should be either a light or an island unto yourself. The same Sanskrit word means both light and island, which is interesting. And Buddha was very, very knowledgeable about language. So I think he understood these dual meanings. But basically what he said is he says, the Dharma will be your guide. So I've given you the teachings that you need, and that Dharma should be what you use to practice Buddhism. So in essence, unlike in Catholicism for something, he didn't appoint a leader. He didn't appoint, if you like, a pope of Buddhism. So for that reason, it's made Buddhism very free. I mean, there's nobody to say you're practicing Buddhism right or you're practicing wrong. And so as Buddha has spread around the world, there's so some people today, because the Dalai Lama is so prominent in the news and so well known, a lot of people sort of associate Buddhism with the Dalai Lama. But the Dalai Lama only represents Tibetan Buddhism. And in fact, he's not even in charge of the order of Tibetan Buddhism, the sect of Tibetan Buddhism he belongs to. But, quite frankly, he's sort of by the Tibetan people, he's sort of acknowledged as their leader. And so they will basically, they have so much confidence in him, they will follow whatever he says. But the Buddha is not the head of Buddhism. I mean, the Dalai Lama is not the head of Buddhism. There is no head of Buddhism. And each country, there's no head of Buddhism in each country. So, for example, if you go to Japan, as we'll talk about, you have Zen. And I think there's sort of 4 major sects in Zen. And there's no head of Zen. If you go in the Theravadan tradition, there's no head of the Theravadan tradition. And it's sort of like that wherever you go. And so for that reason, I think is what has made Buddhism so wide open. So I would say that everybody follows the core concepts of Buddhism. So Buddhism all around the world follows the core concepts, which are the concepts that I'm going to teach you in this course. But there are a lot of different variants, and especially when you get to practice, people practice in different ways. There's some people who give a lot of teachings. Our tradition actually is a very good teaching order. It tends to provide a lot of teachings on Buddhism. And in fact, we often get people from other forms of Buddhism, like Zen Buddhists and so forth, who come to our center because we sort of supply sort of teachings that often in their tradition, they aren't so focused on giving. Other types of Buddhism focus heavily on meditation. And in fact, some students say they go there and they just start meditating immediately and they're not even quite sure what they're doing. But I mean, Buddha himself strongly emphasized meditation. So meditation is extremely important. But I'm just trying to give you a feel that there are these different flavors. And some people have, in the Tibetan tradition, we talk about many different forms of different types of Buddhas, which I will explain. I know Chenrezig is the Tibetan name, but we have Tara and Medicine Buddha and all sorts of Manjushri, many different types of Buddhas. If you go in the Theravadan tradition, they don't talk about any forms of Buddhas. So Buddhism comes in these many different ways, which can be confusing. But I will try to go through all of that. And there is a big split between what they call Hinayana, or foundational Buddhism, and Mahayana. There was a big change in Buddhism that came around the birth of Christ, which is called Mahayana tradition. And so that is a really important thing to do, and that heavily flavors all of these other forms of Buddhism. So I will come back and talk more about that as well. Okay. So the other thing too, which I think is helpful to talk a little bit about, is that The Buddha was born in India, roughly 500 BC is the rough. We don't actually know exactly when, so I would say 500 BC plus or minus 100 years, because in India, for various reasons of the Vedas and so forth, they didn't attach a lot of importance to recording dates and so forth. So part of the reason we have trouble in India is that in India and the ancient India, they didn't attach, so they didn't think it was that important to write down all these dates and everything. But anyway, the original Buddha came around 500 BC, and he taught to the people of his era. So he used terminology, language, concepts that would be familiar to the people he was talking to. And so that can be a little bit of a difficulty in learning Buddhism. And so what we have to do is we have to translate that to the modern day and sort of, and that's why people have to continually give teachings in Buddhism, because we have to sort of update that and explain what that means to modern people. But it's not difficult. Okay, so what is the main point in Buddhism? Why should you practice Buddhism? And so I think the main message that Buddha gave is he said that the one thing that all humans share is all humans want to be happy and to avoid suffering. And that notion of everybody wanting to be happy and to avoid suffering actually colors all the rest of Buddhist teachings. For one way that it colors the teachings is it means that we're all the same. Even though we have different, personalities, we have, if you go around the world, people have different traditions, people have different ways of living. But nonetheless, people share this common wish to be happy. That sort of is the guiding role of all humans. And the other wish is the wish to avoid suffering. And that's the other thing that, dominates most of our thinking. And in fact, I think most people who come to a spiritual tradition precisely for that reason, because life is difficult. Modern life is difficult. Life has always been difficult. There's always been, it's always been hard to live a life. There's very few people that sail through life without difficulties. And so a big purpose of Buddhism is to help you deal with the difficulties of life. And Buddhism has wonderful techniques for dealing with the difficulties of life. And I think that the main reason to practice Buddhism is precisely for that. Because, for me personally, it has been so helpful in getting through day to day, every day, living my life. For making my life better, I feel like my life is immensely better because I practice Buddhism. And of course, for each of you, what you have to do is you have to just try it out and see whether it makes your life better, because each of us is different. So I've said that everybody's the same. So everybody is the same, but everybody is also different in the sense that different people need different things. And Buddhism has that ability to be both. So Buddhism recognizes that we're all the same and that we all wish to be happy and avoid suffering, but we're all individuals. So we each have our own individual spiritual path. And so in Buddhism, you can carve out your own individual spiritual path. And it's important to do that. Because what Buddha always said is, in Buddhism, it's always emphasized, you start from wherever you are. Whoever you are right now, that's your starting point. And then slowly you build to that. And eventually, we will all build to roughly the same place, to full enlightenment or liberation or nirvana, if you like. But the starting point for where we are is all different. Some people need a lot of religious ceremony. Some people hate religious ceremony. Some people, philosophy is important. Other people, it's not important at all. For meditation is sort of important for everybody. But if you're not a meditator, you can still learn to deal with the difficulties, the problems of life without meditating. So I think there's sort of room for everybody in Buddhism. And I think it's important to realize that and not feel that you have to go lockstep with any given teaching or so forth. Okay, so what are other things? Another important thing to talk about is that Buddhism is really focused on the mind. Over and over again, we talk about the mind. And the reason we talk about the mind is because the mind is where everything happens in our life. And in particular, in terms of happiness and suffering, are two major topics of everyone's life. All of that happens in your mind. Whether you're a happy or a miserable person depends on how your mind reacts to the situations in which you find yourself. And in Buddhism, it is possible to learn to be happy even when you're underneath difficult situations. And in fact, it's considered in Buddhism, I will talk about this, there's a notion of transforming all of your life onto the spiritual path. There's a notion of actually using even difficult times in your life to advance your spiritual life so that you can find meaning even in difficulties. But I will come back to that later. That's a more advanced teaching. Certainly in Buddhism, oh yeah, the other thing too is that Buddhism is very practical. Buddha when he taught a lot in metaphors. He would give you little metaphors. So I'm going to give you one metaphor that he taught. When Buddha was alive, he wasn't that interested in philosophy, actually. What he was interested in was interested in helping people reduce suffering. And what he said about this is he gave a metaphor for this. He said, imagine that you're in a forest and you're walking along and you get shot with a poison arrow. When you get shot with a poison arrow and your friends come to help you, when they come to help you, they aren't going to look at the arrow and say, oh, the wood of this arrow is fantastic. I wonder whether it's oak or spruce. Look at the feathers, they're so beautiful. I wonder what kind of bird the feathers came from. All of these sorts of things are irrelevant to you in your current situation. The thing that's relevant is you're suffering and you need help. So what's relevant is pulling the arrow out, maybe cauterizing it, maybe sucking out the poison, maybe bandaging it. And basically that's what Buddha said. He said, all of you people are suffering and I'm here to help you suffer, to get out of this suffering. And so that's my goal. So the Buddha's goal was, he made there was no nonsense or no whatever. It was extremely focused on reducing people's suffering. And basically what he said is, I found a way to do this. And I know that you can do this because I've done it. I've accomplished this goal. And if you follow the same path that I followed, which is the path which I'm going to teach you, you can eventually eliminate your own suffering as well. So that practical focus is another coloring that colors all of Buddhism. So you can see all the different national characteristics of different types of Buddhism, but a key emphasis is always on suffering. And you can see from that also, there's also a very key emphasis on compassion, loving kindness, caring about people, which is incredibly important. Which we'll talk a lot about that also. And that's a very important part of Buddhism. And there is a good reason to care about everybody else. And that's the reason I gave you before. We're all the same in the sense that we all want to be happy and avoid suffering. So you can ask yourself, for example, why should you suffer in order to make me happy? Because there's nothing that makes me better than you. And there's nothing that makes you better than me. So there's no reason why you should suffer so I can be happy. And there's no reason why I should suffer so that you can be happy. And once you look at it from that point of view, it gives you an essence of morality. It says that we shouldn't be harming each other. In the same way, I don't want to be harmed. I shouldn't be harming you. And since we're all equal, there's no reason, so I shouldn't steal something from you because I want it and makes me happy, because then you would suffer. Why should I do that? Why am I, why do I deserve that? I don't, because I'm the same as you. So that also, once you get that idea, it also gives you sort of it's very helpful, because all Buddhist morality revolves around, is basically that whole idea of non-harming and being beneficial to people. Okay. Okay, so I will, yeah, and the other thing too is that a lot of things that what Buddha talked about is he talked a lot about ethics. And there'll be a lot of ethics that will come in from karma, which we will talk about. But in a certain sense, what Buddha really emphasized is beneficial things. What's beneficial for you, what's beneficial for others. So what he emphasized is you should live life in a way that makes you happier, that is more beneficial for you. And basically, he said that is a moral life. And like I said, a moral life in Buddhism is a life that is beneficial, that's helpful, that's non-harming. And in the same way, you know, we want to be beneficial to others. And if we sort of develop this notion of being beneficial, it will make all of our life better. And so, and again, and in fact, that's the strongest reason for practicing morality, is to make your life happy. One thing we will talk about is what is the opposite of an unhappy mind. The opposite of the opposite of a happy mind is an unhappy mind, and an unhappy mind is a disturbed mind, an unpeaceful mind. A happy mind is a peaceful mind. An unhappy mind is a disturbed mind. And so one of the goals in Buddhism is to develop this sort of peacefulness in your life, this sort of calm, radiating peacefulness, that kind of happiness, a happiness that sort of glows from deep inside you and sort of bubbles out from you. And when you're agitated, anxious, nervous, worried, those are the things that we want to overcome. And that's actually the goal of a lot of meditation, is to help you overcome that. But the goal is actually to lead a better life. And so each of the things that the Buddha taught should be helping you live a better life. And in fact, if you're practicing the Buddhist path and your life is not getting better, or if it's getting worse, then it probably means you're not practicing correctly. And so anyway, we will continue talking more about that as well. Another aspect that I want to emphasize is Buddhism is non-authoritarian. So there are, because of national characteristics, sometimes when you get into some of the religious aspects, you will find, you know, a monk or a great religious teacher, you know, telling you, you got to do this, you got to do that. But fundamentally, Buddhism, from the very beginning and the way that Buddha taught it, is meant to be non-authoritarian. Each person is, like I told you, at the end of his life, Buddha refused to appoint a Pope of Buddhism. The Buddha said, you know, be an island or lamp unto yourself. Practice the Dharma. And actually, the other thing that the Buddha said that's very important, again, when I was saying that belief isn't that important, the Buddha said, don't believe the teachings that I am teaching you just because I'm the Buddha. Go out and try out the teaching yourself and see if they work. And that's why you should develop confidence in me, because you see that the teachings actually work. There was another time in another sutra of the Buddha. The sutras were the collected sort of teachings of the Buddha that were recorded. The monks all got together and recorded all the different teachings they got. And these things were recorded in different accounts, which were called sutras. I'll come back and talk more about that later. But anyway, in one of the sutras, the Buddha went into a town and the people said, look, you know, you're the 10th spiritual teacher who's come in the last 3 months, and everybody's teaching all different things. How should I know which person to believe? And what the Buddha said, he said, basically, follow the teacher who teaches you the most beneficial things, the things that make your life better, basically, is what he said. And so that is a notion that I think flows through all of Buddhism. Buddhism is really meant to be something to be practiced. and for people to develop confidence. And the way it usually works is you begin with a few teachings. The teacher teaches you some things you find helpful. You start practicing it, and it works for you. It makes your life better, and you enjoy it, so then you keep doing. And eventually what will happen is you will develop faith in Buddhism, which means confidence in Buddhism, that this really is a very helpful path. And then when you do that, you're more likely to be willing to try out more things that the Buddha said, and maybe to believe some things which are not so obvious, such as rebirth and karma and some of these other things. So anyway, that's a little bit of a flavor of the Buddhist path. The other thing that I will say is Buddhism, as the Buddha taught it, is meant to be a gradual practice. In one of the sutras, one of these teachings that the Buddhas gave to somebody, he described, again, one of these analogies. He talked about, imagine yourself on this very nice sandy beach near the ocean, let's say, and imagine walking out into the ocean. What happens is you walk out into the ocean. At first, you're on the shore, you're dry. You walk in a little bit, your feet and ankles get wet, you go deeper, your legs get, covered with water, and you go deeper and deeper. And the Buddha said this is the way that it's meant to practice Buddhism. It's a gradual thing where you gradually transform yourself. And there's a reason for this. The other thing which has always attracted me about Buddhism is that it's a very rational religion, in the sense that there's a reason why you do everything. And as I've studied it more and more, I've learned more and more of these reasons, and it makes more and more logical sense to me. And the reason why Buddhism is a gradual spiritual path is because the spiritual transformation is really transforming your own mind, getting rid of the negativities in your mind, developing more positive attitudes, getting rid of bad habits of mind, creating good habits of mind. And that's basically how Buddhism works to make your life better. And because at the current moment, all of us are filled with very bad habits of mind for which we suffer. It creates anxiety, worry, all sorts of things. We have sort of all sorts of various negative attitudes, which, we've just accumulated willy-nilly just through, working through life. And in doing all of these things, our lives aren't as happy as it could be. And part of the practice of Buddhism is to point out these things, that these different ways of looking at life, how you look at life really does matter. And if you transform the way that you look at life, you will start transforming your life. You'll start living life differently. But to do that, you're going to have to get rid of old bad habits of mind, ways that you habitually do things, and you'll have to create new habits of mind. And it takes time to do that. And so in Buddhism, there's a lot of emphasis on, for example, repetition. Meditation is considered very, very, very powerful, because the deepest way you can access your mind is through meditation. And through meditation is the way you can have the most profound impact on your mind. And so that is actually the deepest way in which you can transform your life. But of course, you have to meditate correctly. Any old meditation won't transform your life. You have to learn. So in Buddhism, it's taught how to meditate and and there's a lot. In fact, meditation is not just one meditation. Meditation is this huge area. There's many different types of meditation you can do, and you use different types of meditations for different types of help that you need, and for different purposes. And actually, we have another introductory course that follows after this that is taught by my friend Stephen. So every other month, so 1 month we do this course. The next month, Stephen does the Introduction to Meditation course. And now we're starting to alternate, and then I'll repeat this course 2 months from now. So, but anyway, that's, and in that course, he part of the goal of that course is to talk about all of these different types of meditation and what their purposes are, and how you develop your own meditation path. But anyway, so Buddhism is meant to be, at least as the Buddha originally taught it, is meant to be a gradual transformation. And the other thing too in Buddhism is everything is cause and effect. So we will talk about karma, which is basically cause and effect. But basically the Buddha kept saying, you know, if you don't create the causes for something to happen, it won't happen. If you do create the causes and conditions for something to happen, it will happen. So the Buddhist path to enlightenment is not, there's no magical spiritual blessing that the Dalai Lama or some other high monk will give you that will make you enlightened. The only way you can become enlightened is through your own hard work. And what that means is that you have to transform your mind, transform the way you live, which is not a radical thing. You don't have to go off to a desert and become a hermit or anything. But anyway, it's mainly about changing your mind. So if you create to become enlightened or to achieve nirvana or even to be happy, you have to create the causes and conditions to do that. And in Buddhism, it's very detailed how you do this. They will give you lots of details for different, and most of these details are different ways of thinking about things. For example, for anger is considered a bad thing in Buddhism. It disturbs your mind. It does not make you happy. There are many, many, many techniques in Buddhism for dealing with anger. And many of these techniques are just looking at anger in a different way. And so all of these different techniques are taught to you, and then you start applying them. And if one technique doesn't work, because we're all different, there are 10 other techniques you can try, which might work better for you. So anyway, that's the way that Buddhism works. Everything has to have is causal. And so for that reason, as we're going to see when we get into the Four Noble Truths and the very ground basic teaching of the Buddha, which is the Four Noble Truths, you will see that it's all causally based. And that's basically the importance of karma, because karma is a form of this sort of causal basis. Okay, so at this point, let me stop and just see if there's any questions, because I've thrown all sorts of things at you. And a lot of the stuff I've thrown at you, I'm going to come back and revisit in greater detail as we go through the course. But the other thing that's true in Buddhism is that it's very interconnected. If you start teaching any aspect of Buddhism, all of these other aspects will flow in and reinforce each other. And so actually that's the other thing that's wonderful about Buddhism, is that each area you practice actually reinforces other areas, and it becomes easier and easier to practice as you go along, because everything is reinforcing, and it really does all work together in a wonderful way. But let me ask if there's any questions, because I've thrown so many things at you. Okay. So anyway, so I've just given you just a flavor of Buddhism, a sort of flavor of the way things work. And I hope that as we go through each of the individual things, you'll sort of re-engage with this flavor, and you'll see how it all sort of flows together. So now what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the life story of Buddha. So as I said, the Buddha lived, I like to think of it roughly 500 BC. It's a nice round number, and it's close enough. As I say, because of the way that Indians did not emphasize a lot about dates and biographies and stuff, they thought the Vedas were eternal, so you didn't need to worry about things like dates or anything, details of lives or history. So anyway, because of that, it's dating is a little bit difficult. And so some people think that Buddha was born a little earlier, maybe 600 BC. Some people a little bit later, closer to 400 BC. But I think sort of 500 BC is a nice round number for when Buddha lived. So that's when Buddha lived. He's given various names. The name that you're often given is Buddha Shakyamuni. is a common name that's given for the historical Buddha. And the Shakya part of the name comes from the fact that he was born into a clan of Buddhists in a particular city, sort of almost like city-state, so he was born into the Shakya clan. In some accounts, his father was the king. He was sort of living in a little kingdom, and his father was the king. Other accounts say that it was closer to a republic, and his father was sort of the head of the little country in which they lived. But anyway, the Shakya clan was the clan that dominated the city and place where he grew up. So that's where the Shakya comes from. Muni is just a Sanskrit word that means basically sage or wise man. And so he was called Shakyamuni, and then Buddha after he became the Buddha. And we'll talk about the Buddha is a Sanskrit word which basically means the awakened one. Okay, so when Buddha grew up, there were all these, it was almost like ancient Greece where they had like all these almost like small city-states or small principalities that were all fighting with each other. In some ways, almost like the medieval ages, because there were vassals. And modern scholars think that actually the place where Buddha grew up was actually a vassal of a slightly neighboring country called Kosala. But anyway, there was a lot of infighting among these different little kingdoms, and sometimes some of them would grow bigger, and sometimes, they would take over the other countries and so forth. So when the Buddha was born, before he was born, there was a lot of mystical prophecies that were given. And so they consulted various soothsayers, fortune tellers, or whatever to sort of figure out what was going on. And this one person in particular, who was considered very wise, said, yes, you're going to have a son, and the son is going to become a great person, but he can go in two directions. And this is important for the rest of Buddha's biography. He said one direction he can go is he can become a great king. So there was this notion in India that you could become a great king and conquer essentially the whole world. So one direction that the Buddha could have gone is he could have become a great king and essentially took over all of India, was sort of the prophecy. The other direction that he could go is he could become a great religious leader. And so those were the two ways that were born, that happened. So then, there's a lot of, if you read it, there's a lot of mystical things about the dreams that his mother had and so forth. And supposedly I think his mother was going to visit her family when Buddha was born. So he was not born in the city. He was born in the countryside. There's things about she gave birth while he was standing up. And supposedly when he came out, all of these wonderful things happened, and he came out sort of full grown completely, and he could walk and say things. So, but anyway, all of that doesn't matter. The important thing is he was born. Not too long after he was born, his mother actually died. I don't know whether it was weeks, certainly not more than a few months, his mother died. So he had a surrogate mother in his aunt. His mother's sister sort of took over nursing him and all of that sort of stuff. So he was sort of, his aunt sort of became the mother figure. He grew up in tremendous luxury. And part of and this connects with this earlier story of the prophecy. His father wanted him to grow up as a great king. He didn't want any of this great spiritual leader sort of stuff. He wanted his son to become a great king. So he did everything he could to dissuade his son from following a religious path. So he grew up in great luxury. And some of the things we know from this Buddha himself actually mentioned in passing as he was giving various teachings. The Buddha said, I actually had 3 different palaces. There were 3 different seasons, a rainy season, hot and cold season or something like that in India. And for each of these different seasons, I had my own separate palace to live in. This palace was populated by all women, musicians, and women servants to sort of entice them to sort of the sensual side, away from the religious spiritual side. So he talked about how he grew up in great luxury. He eventually did actually marry, which is interesting, and he had one son. And as the story goes, so most of his life we don't know the details of. I mean, there is a few other things, but most of it we don't know much more than that. According to the main lore, and again, this is important for the way he lived his life and his spiritual teachings. According to the lore, maybe a year or sometime before he left on his spiritual quest, he met with what was sometimes called the three messengers. So his father never wanted him to go out and visit the town or any place else. His father tried to sequester him in these palaces because he didn't want him to have any chance of being influenced by a spiritual person. But the Buddha managed to break out 3 times. And the first time he broke out is he went with a trusted servant, and they went around the town, and he saw somebody that was really sick. And when he saw that, apparently he said that made a huge impact on him, that he realized, oh, I could become sick like that. That would be really terrible. A second time, he went out and he saw an old person. And then suddenly he struck it. Oh, one day I'm going to become old. And that would be really terrible. What good is life if we all have to eventually suffer old age? And then finally, the third time he went out and he discovered a dead person. And he realized he was going to die. And again, it was the same sort of thing. What is the value of sort of life if all of these terrible things can happen to you? And according to the lore, this is the thing that sort of led him on to the spiritual path. Sometimes they talk about a fourth messenger, that he went out and met an ascetic, a spiritual person also. And that maybe helped give him the idea of following the spiritual path. So anyway, these ideas were bubbling up on him. And the thought that really consumed him is the thought of suffering. So this theme that I talked about earlier on, this notion of suffering. So what Buddha said is, suffering is just impossible. It's unacceptable that we should have to deal with suffering. There has to be some solution in this world where we can get rid of suffering. There has to be some way of doing this. And he, according to the lore, he said it as his life's work to find this goal of eliminating suffering. This was his goal of his life. And about the time, he had one son that was born. So according to the lore, just after his first son was born, he finally decided, I have to do something about this. I have to follow a spiritual life. So shortly after his first son was born, he snuck out of the palace and left. And essentially he became what was an ascetic. And at that time in India, which is actually still true today. So at that time in India, the main religion of India came from the Vedas. There were these Aryan people who swept in, took over the country. They're actually related in some ways to the ancient Greeks that were the same Aryan people that swept in from the plains of Russia or something like that. That's why the language of ancient Greek and Sanskrit are very similar, actually. They were all Indo-Europeans. But anyway, the main religion came from these things. And it was a religion very similar to the Greeks. It emphasized sacrifices and all of these sorts of things also. So that was the main Vedic religion. And the Brahmins were in charge of that. The Brahmins were the people that took care of all of that. They performed the sacrifices and so forth. And they were sort of, at that time, in today's world, the Brahmins are sort of top dogs. and they have been in India for several thousand years. But at that time, the class to which the Buddha became, there is a caste system in India, which the Buddha never believed in, but in the caste system to which Buddha was born to the Kshatriya class, which is the warrior class, the class of kings and rulers and warriors. That was his class that he belonged to. And that's sort of way up there also. So the two highest classes have always been the Brahmin and the Kshatriya class. And at that time, when Buddha was around, it seems like those two classes were fairly equal. I think in the modern world, the Brahmin class is sort of taken over as the most important class. But at, let's see. So at any rate, at that time, so you had this main Vedic religion, but you also had all of these people who populated the forests, who were just religious seekers, who would just go off and they would give teachings, and they were ascetics. And a lot of these people went naked, or they wore rags, or they, clothed themselves in leaves. They went in all different forms. They believed all sorts of different things. There were materialists. They were, spiritual seekers, people who promised miracles, people, sort of every type of religious belief you could think, where you could find these ascetics that would wander around, and they lived off of alms. So they would beg in the cities, and it was considered in the cities, as it is today, I think, that it was considered very wonderful to actually help these people out and give them food, medicine, or whatever. And so essentially, this is what the Buddha became. He wandered off into these people. And when he did this, he went to find somebody who could give him spiritual teachings. And so the first person he went to gave him, basically taught him very deep meditations. And so the Buddha went to this person, and he started getting these teachings. And after a while, he thought, actually, I think that I could accomplish all the same things that my teacher accomplished. If I work really hard, I think I can do this. And so he set his mind very forcefully on this, and he achieved the same deep meditation levels that his teacher accomplished. And at that point, his teacher said, oh, well, maybe you should join me. We can co-teach together our little religious community. But at that point, the Buddha said, no, this is not good enough. I still haven't answered my problem. What do I do about suffering? How do I stop suffering? So the Buddha left this community and went searching further, and he found another spiritual teacher who taught him really super high levels of meditation, very, very deep levels of meditation. And again, and this teacher actually, he said, wow, you've even surpassed me. I'm going to let you take over the community. But again, the Buddha said, no, I still haven't solved my problem. So at that point, the Buddha went off. So this all happened. So this started when Buddha was around 29. So for the rest of his time, the Buddha went and found a group of 5 other ascetics, and they all sort of agreed to practice extreme asceticism, extreme mortification. And so the Buddha practiced this, thinking, if I can practice this extreme asceticism, this will maybe be the breakthrough when I can get the answer. And so he did this for quite a long time. He talked about his bones were showing, his hair was falling out. He was, eventually he came actually very close to death. And he was living on, practically no food at all. He talks about, 1 grain of rice a day or once a week or something. So it was this extreme asceticism. But again, it failed. It didn't bring him any closer to his goal. And at that point, he remembered, according to the story, and I think this is a story that he himself said, he remembered a time when, as a youth, he was just sitting under, I think it was a rose apple tree in an orchard, watching his father bless some crops that his countrymen were there. It was the start of a new agricultural season or whatever. They were putting seed in the ground or something. And he just sort of drifted off in meditation. And he had these wonderful, peaceful meditations. And it occurred to him, maybe this is the correct path. And as soon as he came to that, he realized that the asceticism wasn't doing him any good at all. I mean, he was nearly killing himself. He was close to death, but it wasn't spiritually beneficial. And so at that point, he stopped his asceticism. There are various stories of, I think there was one woman who found him and gave him food and so forth. And anyway, nursed him back to health. And so he regained his health. And at that point, he started practicing what he called the middle way. And this is another really, really important aspect of Buddhism, which I know sometimes it gets lost a little bit in some of the teachings. But the Buddha always talked about the middle way. And again, he gave one of these analogies. And the analogies that he gave is he talked about playing a musical instrument. You know, if you take a sitar or some stringed instrument, if you have a string, if it's really loose, it flops around and it doesn't make any sound. If it's really tight, eventually it breaks. But to produce a beautiful sound, what you need to do is you need to tighten it enough so it rings, so it resonates, but not so tight that it breaks. And the Buddha said, this is the correct spiritual path, the middle way. These various extremes are not the correct path. And that's, again, a recurrent emphasis in Buddhism, not to follow extremes, to follow sort of a middle path. And so it was at this point that the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and had his breakthrough to great enlightenment. And when he had this great breakthrough to enlightenment, there's mystical parts where he was attacked by the Maras, sort of negative spiritual forces and so forth. But the other important thing is he said that he reached this breakthrough where suddenly his mind became completely serviceable. So his mind, he could direct his mind to any area that he wanted to, and he could see what was happening. So he directed his mind to past lives, and he could see all of his past lives. And in every single past life, he knew who he was, how he lived, what happened to him, you know, and how for all of his past lives. And then he said he directed his mind to other people, and he could see how other people were living their lives, what was happening to them, you know, where they had come from in their past lives, you know, where their life was trending, what was going to happen to them in their future lives. And then he basically said that he saw how the world really is, how everything works, and he found the solution. He found the path to liberation, how to eliminate his suffering. And that is what's known as nirvana. And so he achieved that state of nirvana, so that, as he said, from in the future, he would never be reborn again. Okay, so I'm going to come back and talk more about this notion of nirvana and the state that he achieved. And then at that point, he went off and he started giving teachings. So he was around 29 when he left home, and he achieved this enlightenment around the age of 35. And then he lived until he was nearly 80 years old. So around the age of 80 is when he died. So basically he taught for roughly 45 years. And because of having taught for 45 years is why we have, you know, why there's so much Buddhist teachings available, because essentially people remembered all of these various things that he taught. And when he died, it's said that he achieved parinirvana, which meant that he had achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, but still he was still living as a living being, and so and so this is called nirvana with remainder, meaning he still had a physical human body. But then when he died, that was it. He was never born again. And that is sort of a meaning of nirvana, sort of a blowing out of life. And so he achieved what is sort of, you know, what we would call sort of heaven, you know, infinite happiness forever. Okay, so that is the main sequence of his life. Well, let me ask if there's, let's see, I think there may be in the chat box, maybe there's some questions in it.
Bob.
Oh, okay. Somebody recommends another course by Glenn Svensson, who teaches a good meditation course. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So you people can see that. So who had a question? Oh.
Hi, Bob. This is TH. I have a question.
Okay.
I think you might have been in Jen Don's class earlier this week.
Yes, I was.
Where he talked about the distinction between liberation versus enlightenment.
Yes.
And so just want to, I mean, you're telling the story of Buddha's life, which is great. Thank you very much. Yeah. Did he achieve just liberation, or did he also go on to achieve enlightenment?
He achieved full enlightenment at the same time.
Okay, so it's 2 in 1.
Two in one. He got 2 for the price of 1. Yes, and I mean there are other things that the Buddha. There are in the Buddhist scriptures. I'm going to talk about the different forms of scriptures a little bit. But one form of scriptures that was taught in Buddhism are called the Jataka Stories. And these are stories of Buddha's previous lifetimes. So at various times, Buddha apparently talked about his previous lives. And he talked about previous lives when he was in the animal form, when he was in the human form. He was kings, he was animals, he was religious teachers. And he said that there were also previous Buddhas before his time. And he actually lived and got teachings from previous Buddhas eons ago. And so it is, so although he achieved enlightenment in this period around 500 BC, he'd apparently had, he had been, had countless lives before then where he had over a long period of time had developed himself. So even though he achieved enlightenment in his final lifetime, he had done a lot of work before then for a long, long period of time. So it wasn't as though, so in his life, it looks like he just suddenly came to this realization. But again, in Buddhism, everything is causal. There's causes and conditions. And he had created all of the causes to achieve enlightenment in this his final lifetime by all of the previous spiritual work that he had done. And so he did achieve full enlightenment. Now, I will talk about this notion of liberation and enlightenment, because when Buddha taught, he mainly taught in his lifetime a path to what we call liberation, or becoming an arhat, which means becoming liberated from samsara. In other words, never being reborn in this world of suffering. And I'm going to talk more about what samsara is. So that was the main sort of goal that he taught his immediate followers during his lifetime. However, it was very clear that while Buddha was actually alive, and while Buddha was alive, many of his followers did achieve liberation from samsara. They did become arhats, meaning that they would never be reborn again. But even at that point, it was recognized that there was sort of a big gap between these arhats and the actual Buddha himself. That the Buddha himself was sort of omniscient, knew everything, whereas a lot of times these arhats didn't. And so it was very clear that there was, even at the time that Buddha was alive, a distinction between Buddha himself and simple liberation from samsara. And later on, Buddhism developed, I'll explain the Mahayana Path, which is the path for full enlightenment, to achieve the same sort of enlightenment that Buddha achieved. And there is an explicit path for achieving that. And that is actually what Gendon is teaching actually last night. That class that he's teaching is the final segment of how you achieve that final, how you move actually through liberation, first of all, and then from liberation to full enlightenment is there is a detailed path that you follow. Again, you have to create the causes and conditions to do this. And it's explained exactly what you need to do to accomplish these things. So that's what Don's class is focusing on right now, is he's talking about these 5, especially Mahayana paths, which are, when you hit those 5 paths, you're practically nearly a Buddha. You don't hit those until you're a very advanced spiritual being. But nonetheless, yeah, there is a distinction between liberation and full enlightenment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But yeah, thank you for asking that question. That's and sometimes we call these things nirvana, achieving nirvana. And so both of these things are called achieving nirvana, but sometimes they talk about a small nirvana or a big nirvana. So the small nirvana is achieving liberation from samsara, which is an amazing goal all by itself. But the full enlightenment is sort of like the full or big nirvana, which is the goal of the Mahayana path, which again we will be getting to. But I can't say everything at once, so we'll have to work up there gradually. And it doesn't matter, because actually the path is the same. Because if you follow the path to full enlightenment, you follow the same path in the beginning stages. So you follow exactly the stage to liberation. But then for a person following the Mahayana path, at that point, you don't sort of check out and go into nirvana, but you continue to practice and actually purify your mind further and further to achieve full enlightenment. And so all of this, another way of looking at this path is, again, we talked about the negativities in our minds. And so achieving liberation or nirvana is all about purifying the negativities of your mind and creating positive karma or positive merit, which is what you need to accomplish anything good. You have to achieve positive karma or merit, sometimes called punya in Sanskrit. And so essentially, when you achieve liberation, you've gotten rid of all of the negativities of your mind, but you have to create additional merit to achieve full enlightenment. And we will talk more, give more details about that. That's further on in the course. But anyway, have I answered your question?
I have a follow-up, if you don't mind. So I'm a little confused that he achieved liberation, which means the result of that is you don't come back to samsara. But
Yes.
Then he also achieved enlightenment, where you, as a bodhisattva, out of compassion for wanting to liberate other beings to get them to the point of liberation, then you come back. So why was it that when he passed around 80 years old, why did he not come back?
Okay. This actually gets a little bit into the different schools of Buddhist thought. So in the, So in the Tibetan tradition that we're in now, the way that it's taught is essentially when you achieve liberation from samsara, if you're following the Hinayana, or the foundational path of Buddhism, at that point, you can achieve nirvana and never be reborn again. However, in the Mahayana path, the path of the Bodhisattva, even though he's not required to be reborn, he chooses to be reborn in samsara again and again. Although, quite frankly, once you become liberated, you never experience suffering ever again. So even though you're in samsara, which is again, I'll have to describe more and more about what samsara is. So even though you're in a place that for all the rest of this is a place of suffering, actually as a bodhisattva, you don't achieve suffering, but you can, as a bodhisattva, you can willingly be chosen to be reborn again. Whereas normally for most of the rest of this, we're forced to be reborn again, although we sort of force it ourselves in a sense. So it's our own attachment to samsara that causes us to be reborn again and again. And another way of describing liberation is we finally give up that attachment to samsara. But anyway, for most of us, we have no choice. We keep being reborn in samsara over and over again until we can achieve a state of liberation. And at that point, we can escape samsara, and we're in sort of this blissful state, which is completely outside of the normal, anything that we know of, normal samsara. Now, for a bodhisattva, they realize that they have not completely purified their mind, that even though they've gotten rid of all of the gross negativities in their mind, they talk about there's a slight impurity of mind, that the way they describe it is they describe it as though you have, like, you take a box, a closed wooden box, put garlic inside of it, let it sit for a few days, and then you remove the garlic. You'll notice that there's still a smell of garlic in the box. So removing the garlic is like removing your gross negativities of your mind. And there's still this faint whiff of garlic, which is what is called this touch of, which are the obstructions to omniscience, or the obstructions to full Buddhahood. And those are the things which you have to practice longer on this fifth path of meditation. In Don's class, the 8th, 9th, and 10th rounds of the path of meditation. Those are the things that you're purifying to achieve full Buddhahood. At the same time, you're also generating the enormous amount of merit that you need to achieve this full Buddhahood, which is the other requirement. And then at that point, you achieve full enlightenment. And at that point, you actually do leave samsara. Although in the Tibetan tradition, it's said that we can communicate or connect with these Buddhas and these Buddhas, even though they're not appearing in our world directly, they're nonetheless helping all of us, and have made a vow through their bodhicitta to help us until all of us achieve enlightenment. And in the Tibetan tradition, it's actually said that at some point, every single sentient being, and a sentient being means every being that has a mind, which actually also includes animals and other states of beings besides humans. But it's said that in the Tibetan tradition that it's essentially the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas will continue to work until every sentient being has achieved full enlightenment. That is sort of the way that it's taught in our tradition. So I don't know if that's helpful. I mean, I may try to give more details as we go along. But does that help a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so that's okay. We're jumping ahead of ourselves, but that always happens in this course, and that's perfectly fine. But I will have to spend some time talking about what samsara and nirvana means, and more about these paths and so forth. But anyway, I will continue talking about that. So I think we should take why don't we take well, it's a little bit later than I wanted. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, just to give you a chance to get up and walk around a little bit. And then from then on, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about how Buddhism spread, all the different forms of Buddhism and how Buddhism spread throughout the world. And if I have time, I might begin talking about the Four Noble Truths, which are the deepest teaching of the Buddha. And I think it actually sort of encompasses all the other teachings. You can sort of relate all of the other teachings of the Buddha into these Four Noble Truths. But actually, the next class next week is when I'm going to really focus in great detail on these Four Noble Truths, because these Four Noble Truths are really getting into the nitty-gritty of how Buddhism works. So I've been sort of giving you an introductory flavor, but it's really to really get into the real understanding of Buddhism. I think it really comes from these Four Noble Truths. But I think it's also, again, just for background, it's a little bit helpful to know a little bit about how Buddhism spread. So I can't, obviously, in the short time I have, I can't give you a full history, but I can at least give you a flavor sort of for the way that Buddhism evolved from the time of Buddha to the present day. So I'll try to sort of give you a quick overview of that. So let's, I will set a timer for 5 minutes, and then I'll call you back at that point. Any other questions? Is that okay? Okay. So the next segment that I'm going to begin talking about is actually what happened to Buddhism. So Buddha achieved Nirvana, and then what happened? So that was, again, Buddha lived around 500 BC, so we have about 2,500 years to deal with. And so what happened immediately after Buddha died is, again, like I said, the Buddha did not appoint a leader, a pope of Buddhism, if you like. So, but the Buddhists had to decide what to do. And at that time, there was, a large number of monks, maybe thousands of different monks who were following Buddhism. And of course, they wanted to continue the path that Buddha had taught. So they organized themselves. And the first thing they did is they held a council. They held the Buddhist Council. And at that Buddhist Council, they sort of put together all of the teachings of the Buddha. And at that time, it was an oral society, which is what India was. So these teachings were all memorized, essentially. And people at that time had prodigious memories. And in fact, this was part of the tradition of India. The original Vedas were all memorized also. And in fact, it's possible for humans to achieve remarkable memorization skills. A number of years ago, I watched a TV show about young boys in the Muslim countries who memorized the entire Quran, and not only memorized the entire Quran, but with the correct intonation and the way they rise their voice, lower it, all sorts of details. And what was remarkable is that all these young kids, some of them as young as 10 years old or so, can memorize the entire Quran, but they can do it without knowing Arabic. So they're purely just memorizing sounds. So it's remarkable. So it clearly is possible for people to do this. And in the early time of the monks, they, and there were certain monks or groups of monks that actually were given the job of remembering different parts. So the main parts of the Buddhist canon are the Sutras, the Vinayas, and the Abhidharma, or Buddhist philosophy. So the Sutras are essentially a recording of all the teachings. So so the Buddha would go to some city and he would give some teachings, and they would give a little bit of the background at the start of the sutra, and then they would record what the Buddha taught. Sometimes these are conversations with Brahmins and other people. Sometimes they're just teachings, or sometimes events that happened. And sometimes even Buddha just talking to his main assistant Ananda and so forth. So all of these things are recorded. And these are called the Sutras. And we have a couple of complete collections of these things. And one of the oldest complete collections is called the Pali Canon, because it's recorded in Pali, which is related to Sanskrit. It's sort of a simplified Sanskrit. It's basically what's known as a Prakrit, or sort of vernacular language. So because the people didn't go around speaking Sanskrit, the ordinary people spoke their various native languages, but they were all sort of very similar to Sanskrit. And each little community had different dialects that were very similar. And the Buddha in his life always emphasized teaching in these dialects. He never taught in Sanskrit itself, because he wanted to teach so that the ordinary people could listen to him and understand him, not just the Brahmins. But anyway, the Pali Canon is a whole collection of these. And, there's like 6 or 7 books about 4 or 5 inches thick that are these collected things. And they're wonderful things to read, because they also, you sort of get a sense of who Buddha was, what he said, how he interacted with people. They're really a remarkable thing. So anyway, that was one collection. The other collection that was really important was the Vinaya. And the Vinaya were the rules for the monks. So in the beginning, there was no Vinaya. But as Buddha kept attracting more and more followers, and they had more and more larger and larger numbers of monks, these monks would get in fights with these monks were people. So of course they would get in fights with each other, and they would argue and dispute about various times. And each time there was a problem that arose, the Buddha would make a rule, and that rule got recorded as part of the Vinaya. And the wonderful thing about this is not only the rule got incorporated in the Vinaya, but the original circumstance under which caused the rule to be brought into being in the first place, the original story, also got recorded. So the Vinaya isn't just a rule book, but it also explains why each rule was created, which were the circumstances that caused it to be created. So it's a rather remarkable document. But the Vinaya basically tells the monks how to live in harmony with each other. And then the third thing is the Abhidharma. And the Abhidharma I'll talk more about. That's sort of Buddhist philosophy. But essentially, as Buddha had more and more followers, he couldn't teach everybody. So as is natural, the new people coming in, the younger monks, were being taught by the older, more experienced monks who knew Buddhist teachings. So they would help the monks and give them teachings. And so out of that need to sort of, make a coherent set of teachings is how the Abhidharma, the Buddhist philosophy, sort of grew into being. So it was a way to sort of help people in a coherent way understand all of the teachings of the Buddha. So anyway, so the first important thing is that so they held this first council immediately after the Buddha died and established this. And then the people went off and they started, living their life. And very shortly, they broke up into at least 18 schools. Some people think there were more than 30 different schools of Buddhism. But most of these schools of Buddhism, a lot of reason for the breakup is because there was geographical separation. People were living in different parts of India or Nepal or neighboring countries, and they sort of drifted apart a little bit. But the main reason that they broke apart was not that they were all believing different things necessarily, but they had slightly different Vinaya rules. Because the most important thing for monks to live together in harmony is for everybody to agree on the rules. And most of the time, these separations were caused by people who either thought the rules were too strict or too loose. So you always have certain people that liked really strict, well laid out rules that are, and they're strongly held. So those people would tend to form one community. And there were other people who always said, the details don't matter. We just need to live according to the spirit of the rules. So they would form different communities. And then, of course, there were all sorts of people in between. Although eventually there did develop different Buddhist philosophies, which is eventually how the advanced course is being taught tomorrow morning is about the tenet schools, which goes through a lot of the basically different forms of Buddhist philosophy that over the last couple thousand years developed. But anyway, so that's what happened to Buddhism. So Buddhism originally, Buddha himself lived sort of around northern India. Some of the places where he achieved either birth or liberation, or under the Bodhi church where he achieved light. Some of these significant places may have been in Nepal, actually. So they were sort of around that northern part of India. But Buddhism did spread throughout the rest of India over time. And but for the first time that Buddhism actually spread outside of India really was around the 3rd century BC, when it moved down to Sri Lanka, which are these islands off the southern tip of India. And this movement was actually important because these people that moved to Sri Lanka formed what is now called the Theravadan school of Buddhism. And to some degree, this Theravadan school, because I guess they were an island at various times, they sort of lost connection with the main part of Buddhism. And so they sort of developed separately. And so in today's world, these people, and this, they're called Theravadins. Sometimes they go under the name of Vipassana meditation and things like that. And they're widespread within the United States. There's a group in Santa Fe, as well as all over the United States. But anyway, this is sort of a group of monks that probably is closest to the original form that the Buddha taught Buddhism and lived. And they sort of make a great claim about this, although there's a recent book I was reading which was saying, well, you really shouldn't believe that because they had their own development. So the way that they're practicing Buddhism now is not necessarily identical with the way Buddha did, because over 2,500 years, they also had their own evolution. But anyway, it's probably closest in form to what Buddha taught. And so that they've survived there. They had their ups and downs. In all of these countries, there's various relationships between Buddhism and politics, kings, fights with other religions, and so forth. And again, too much to go into. And Sri Lanka, which earlier used to be called Ceylon, had its ups and downs also, but it's probably, it got started there in the 3rd century BC and it's still there today. Okay, so then there was a famous king in India, Ashoka, who lived around 300 BC, and he promoted Buddhism. So at various times, various kings in India, very powerful rulers of big empires, Ashoka, at that point, commandeered a whole big empire in India. He promoted Buddhism, and he actually poured huge amounts of money and resources, and great monasteries and so forth were eventually established in Buddhism in India. And there were various other councils, which for our purposes isn't important. But I think that the next most important thing that happened in the Buddhist history was around the 1st century BC, or around the time of the birth of Christ. There developed a new form of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism. So, and when the Mahayana Buddhism developed, so yana means vehicle. So Mahayana means great vehicle. And the Mahayanas considered themselves that they had a superior form of Buddhism to the earlier form, which they denigrated by calling Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle. And today, Buddhists are more sensitive. They tend not to like to use the term Hinayana because it's sort of derogatory. So that's why you get, but essentially the only people that practice this earlier form of Buddhism, the Hinayana, which is closer to what the Buddha actually practiced, are the Theravadins, these people in Sri Lanka, who also spread. They did some of the early, in the 2nd century BC, AD, they spread to Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, sort of the surrounding areas. So those people are so that one Theravadin group is the only people that today we would call the Hinayana. Sometimes they also give the name. The Dalai Lama, I think, likes to call it the fundamental vehicle, because it is the fundamental teachings. And the Mahayana is actually, as I will describe, is actually built on top of the Hinayana teachings. So the Hinayana teachings are part of the Mahayana path. So they're not really separate. But the Mahayana, if you like, adds things to the Hinayana. And in a sense, it almost doesn't add things, but it emphasizes more things. So in the Mahayana path, we get a much greater emphasis on others, compassion, and helping others to achieve enlightenment. So in the Hinayana path, the goal is your own liberation from samsara, your own nirvana. And the Mahayana path, there's a great emphasis on helping everybody else get rid of their suffering and also achieve nirvana, or freedom from suffering. So anyway, that Mahayana path started, I like to think about it roughly the time of the birth of Christ, so roughly about 500 years after Buddha was around. And so the Mahayana path, and there are Mahayana Sutras, which the Mahayana said went back to the original Buddha, but they mysteriously appeared 500 years later. So it's a little bit tricky how you do this. But they also say they base their teaching on various Mahayana Sutras. So there is a second addition to the Buddhist canon from the Mahayana Sutras for the Mahayana people. So anyway, that's the next big thing that happened. The next big thing in terms of Buddhist teachings itself that developed was around 700 AD, is the Vajrayana or Tantric path developed. And as I will explain, the Vajrayana or Tantric path is actually part of the Mahayana path, but it's considered an accelerated path to enlightenment, if you like, a way that you can speed up your path to enlightenment. And it involves much more complex esoteric teachings, which I will actually talk about in the fourth final class of this teaching. I will go and explain the Vajrayana. It's called Vajrayana or Tantric path. Is typically the way it's taught, but it is part of the Mahayana path. It's just sort of an accelerated version of it, where you do special practices, if you like. Okay, so in terms of, and that's sort of it. So once you have the foundational or the Hinayana path, you've got the Mahayana path, and then you've got the Tantric or Vajrayana path. So that's sort of it. That's sort of the main Buddhist paths. So by yeah, someone said that explains why Shakyamuni didn't come back for us. Yeah, because I mean it's said actually that the Buddhists have been inspiring these later Mahayana and Tantric teachings to help us further when we were ready for it. Again, that's part of the skillful means of Buddhism. That it's said in the Mahayanas that the reason why Buddha did not teach the Mahayana path initially is because people weren't ready for it. And then after 500 years of Buddhism, it's said that they were finally ready to expand away from their own personal liberation to this notion of helping others or being more compassionate. And then later on, it said, yes, Barbara, you have to unmute yourself.
I didn't want to interrupt you mid-sentence,
Sure.
but I do have a question.
Sure, absolutely.
Where does the Karmapa fit in all of this?
Okay, the Karmapa is the head of one of the 4 Tibetan sects of Buddhism, or 4 lineages, sometimes we'll talk. I'm going to come to that a little bit, but I think he's the head of the Kagyu lineage. And the lineage that we belong to is called the Gelugpa lineage. But I'm going to come to that briefly, so I'll come back to that. But
Okay.
But thanks for asking. I will bring that up.
Thank you.
In a few minutes. Okay, so now I need to backtrack a little bit and talk about where did Buddhism go from here. So where Buddhism went from here is it started gradually spreading sort of outward, basically. So the first big push was to the south, to Sri Lanka and all of those neighboring things. And that stayed pretty close to the traditional thing. But after the Mahayana tradition established itself, for some reason, the Mahayana has been very successful in spreading. So when Buddhism spread to every country after this, it was always the Mahayana form that spread. And there's interesting, one scholar of Buddhism, Edward Kantz, who actually said that the reason it spread was because he felt that the Mahayana was more adaptable to the various local cultures to which it spread, whereas he thought that the Hinayana stayed closer, I guess, to the Indian culture or whatever, culture of India. But anyway, that's just a speculation. But there's no doubt that wherever Buddhism spread after this, after the Mahayana emerged, it was always the Mahayana form version that spread. And the most important place it spread was to China, which of course is right next to India, and a very large country. And of course, China has had emperors, and it's this amazingly powerful country. And I think that it began to spread sometime, basically soon after the Mahayana started. So around the 1st century AD, it started spreading to China. But more important versions spread. The most important version that spread was probably the Zen form of Buddhism that in China is called Chan, which was around 500 AD. But in China, various different forms of Buddhism spread. And in all of these countries that Buddhism spread to, there's usually not just one form, but there's variants. So many times in China, there's many different types of Buddhism that spread. And the reason why there's so many different types of Buddhism is because there was usually some powerful spiritual leader who had some form of Buddhism, often a form of Buddhism that fit very well with the culture of where he was, like, for example, Chinese culture in China and so forth. And then he would gather a large group of following. And then when he gathered a large group of following, various practices in his lineages would develop from there. And then that form of Buddhism would sort of develop into different practices. And usually these things have different ways, different practices of meditation, sometimes various different religious rites. And of course, depending on the country where you were in, different things would resonate. And so that would sort of, and what to me it feels like, and I think other scholars have said this, what it was more, it wasn't so much that you were developing different Buddhist paths so much as different aspects of Buddhism resonated with different cultures. And so as different aspects of Buddhism resonated with different cultures, they would sort of more strongly bring that out or enhance it because it helped Buddhism to spread in that country. And China is a vast country, so of course it developed a lot of different forms of Buddhism. Probably from our perspective, the most important one is the Chan, which from China moved next, I think, to Korea, especially the Chan form. And I think that happened, yeah, that was around the end of the 7th century AD. The Chan form moved to Korea. And even in Korea, there were different forms of Chan or Zen Buddhism developing, depending, again, major leaders who had slightly different ideas of what was important to practice. And then from there, it eventually moved around the 12th century, it moved into Japan. And the form that moved into Japan was mainly the Zen form. And Zen is the Japanese pronunciation for the Chan religion. So it's Chan in China, and Chinese, and it's Zen in Japan. And even in Japan, there are at least 4 different variations of Zen. They're all sort of similar, but they do have variations in what they practice and the path that they follow and so forth. And so I think Zen is the aside from the Tibetan Buddhism, I think Zen is probably in the West the thing that we're most familiar with. And actually in Santa Fe, there's a very famous Zen monastery that attracts people from all over the world. So we certainly have that. And Zen is a very profound thing. Zen is in my mind, it's a fairly arduous practice because it involves long hours of meditation, an extreme amount of meditative practice. But it's very beautiful and it's very profound. And actually, when I was young, it was Zen that attracted me most to Buddhism because the stories of the Zen monks in Japan are hilarious. They were really wild characters there. They were really a lot of fun. So anyway, that's sort of the spread sort of to the east. So the one I've left out is the one, of course, that we belong to, which is the Tibetan tradition. And that spread initially around the 8th century AD. As Padmasambhava was one of the main earlier people. So it's essentially various Tibetan kings would invite prominent Buddhist monks from India. There were many great universities, Buddhist universities that grew up in India, like Nalanda Monastery and so forth. And these had famous teachers. And in Tibet, they kept trying to entice these people up to Tibet to get to teach Buddhism to Tibet. And it started around the 8th century AD with Padmasambhava. And Buddhism seemed to be going very well for a while, but then a new king took over and he was against Buddhism and he essentially pretty much almost wiped Buddhism out in Tibet. And then around 1000 AD, another great Indian scholar called Atisha came to Tibet, supposedly just to go there briefly to get it reestablished and was going to go back to India, but he never did. So he was the one that really got Buddhism really established in Tibet again. And from that time, Buddhism has remained in Tibet. Although, of course, when the communist Chinese took over, they've been pretty much trying to wipe it out since 1949. But anyway, and then in Tibet, we're going to come back to the Karmapa, your earlier question. So the earliest form of Tibetan Buddhism today is called the Nyingma lineage. And that Nyingma lineage is the oldest form. That's sort of the original form that was brought from India to Tibet. And Tibet is very important for Buddhism today because huge amounts of manuscripts from India were translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan. The same thing actually happened in China. China is also a very, very important repository of Buddhist documents. Huge numbers of Buddhist teachings, sutras, all sorts of things were translated from Sanskrit into Chinese. And this became important because the interesting thing that happened is that around 1200 AD, Buddhism got wiped out in India, completely demolished. And this was associated with Muslim invasions of India from the north. And of course, you know, today, just after World War II, India was partitioned into Muslim and almost equal Muslim and Hindu parts. And that all began with these invasions in 1200, where the Muslims spread all throughout India. But at the time when they spread, they literally destroyed the great monasteries. They thought that they were sacrilegious for people of the, Muslim faith, and they wiped out the monks. There is some, people have always said, well, why didn't Buddhism move south and survive? And that's always been a big controversy. There is some recent archaeological evidence I've seen, which has suggested that the Hindus were very much against Buddhism, mainly because Buddhists did not support the caste system. And there was powerful forces that wanted the caste system to survive in Hinduism. And in fact, the caste system survives even till today in modern India. And the Buddha the Buddha himself basically said the caste system is sort of nonsense. And the caste system sort of evolved from the Vedas, various religious teachings in the Vedas. And in the caste system, the Brahmins are on top, and of course you have the outcasts at the bottom. But anyway, there is some suggestion that the Hindus may have conspired with the Muslims to help wipe out Buddhism. But we actually don't know. We don't know completely whether it was just the Muslim invasion or exactly what happened. But the end result is basically Buddhism effectively got wiped out, except for little dabs here and there. So the reason that Buddhism survives in today's world is because it moved to, of course, there's Sri Lanka in the south, and it moved to China, Korea, Japan, and of course, for us, importantly, Tibet. So anyway, the complete Buddhist sutras and most of the main Indian texts that were done by great masters of India explaining Buddhist philosophy survive in Tibetan. So that's a huge repository for Buddhists. And the same thing happens also. A large amount of our stuff survives in China. A small amount has survived in Sanskrit, but the vast majority of stuff, and then of course there's the Pali canon, the Pali teachings from Sri Lanka, from the earlier religion. So anyway, in Tibet, we have the original Nyingma form. Later on, there grew up, and the Nyingma focuses a lot in meditation. Later on, there grew up a Sakya form of Buddhism, which was always, I think, pretty much the smallest lineage. And these were sort of Tibetan scholars, and they were very important in doing a lot of the translations from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And in fact, they even developed special terminology, technical terminology, and ways so that they could accurately translate these Indian texts from Sanskrit into Tibetan. But they were a very important thing because they were the great translators, and they also did. They also gave a lot of teaching. They were a lineage that was focused on teaching, and they grew around in one locale with a certain special monasteries, which is what they evolved around. So that was the second form that came in. And then a third form that came in is the Kagyu, and this is what has to do with the Karmapas. And there were several especially powerful Tantric teachers, Marpa and let's see, what's his name? Milarepa. Milarepa is very famous Tibet. And this was a group of people that really emphasized meditation. Milarepa spent most of his life meditating on caves. It was said at one point he was eating nettles and turned green because he didn't want to take away any time from meditation to go out and beg food from the neighboring people. So he would just eat nettles and turn green for a while, eating nettles. So that was the third form, and that's the form that the Karmapas traditionally lead. They're the head of the Kagyus. The Sakyas have their own leaders that are separate, and I think in the Sakyas they actually marry, and it's sort of passed down from father to son is how their lineage passes down. We actually had the head of the Sakya leader come to Santa Fe about 5 years ago and establish a Sakya center in Santa Fe. And then the final form of Buddhism that developed is the one we belong to, which is the Gelugpa. And that was started by Je Tsongkhapa in the 1400s. He lived around 1400 AD. And eventually that became the most powerful form or the largest form of Tibetan Buddhism, and by far outnumbers all the other three lineages. And politically was always the most important because the Dalai Lama has always come out of the Gelugpa tradition. And so the Dalai Lama has always been a Gelugpa. Although interestingly enough, Dalai Lama is not the head of the Gelugpa tradition. They have a rotating head, a person who rotates through the Ganden throne holder, I think he's called, is the head of the Gelugpa order. But basically the Tibetans have always revered the Dalai Lamas. So in a certain sense, the Dalai Lamas have always been the spiritual leaders of Tibet, even though they belong to the Gelugpa tradition. When the communists came and wiped out Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama escaped to India. And since that time, he's tried to be very careful to be even-handed among all four traditions. And so he actually sometimes learns and gives some of the teachings from the other traditions. And he makes a big effort to be even-handed because the Tibetans have lost their country and he needs to support all of them. And so the form of Buddhism that we belong to is a version of the Gelugpa tradition. So that's sort of the main outline. I've gone over by 5 minutes. I try to end these things because it's, some of you may be in Wisconsin, it's very late, so I don't want to keep you up too long. But let me just ask, so I've gone through and, at breakneck speed, sort of the spread, but at least it gives you a rough feeling for how Buddhism spread throughout the world. And like I say, it's like there is no Pope of Buddhism. The Dalai Lama can't tell the Zen Buddhists what they need to do, and the Zen Buddhists can't tell the Dalai Lamas, and neither of them can tell the Theravadins. So they're all independent. Each country and even each lineage in each country is often they have their own independent leadership and so forth, and follow their own path, but they're all related. And so the path I'm teaching in this course is the core path that the original historical Buddha taught. And then I will spread out into some of the more Tibetan forms, but also it's the main Mahayana path, which even the Zen Buddhists follow the same Indian philosophers that the Tibetans do. So I'll come more to that as we keep going along. So let me stop and ask if there's any questions. Okay. So hopefully I haven't overwhelmed you too much. So what we're going to do for the next class is the next class is really going to be focused on these Four Noble Truths. Because if you get these Four Noble Truths, you really have the main idea of Buddhism. I mean, that is really the core belief, which everybody agrees is the core belief of Buddhism. And then after that, what we're going to do is we're going to actually follow a short Buddhist text by Lama Tsongkhapa, which lays out the full path to enlightenment, starting from the very beginning stages, renunciation, things like that, all the way to these paths that we were talking about, these, as you're approaching all the way to enlightenment, going through liberation and so forth. And as we go through that whole path, we will actually bring out all of the main ideas of Buddhism. And then at the end, we will clean up a little bit by talking about, so as we follow that path, we will follow both the Hinayana path initially, and then we'll add to that notions of bodhicitta, the Mahayana path. And then at the end of that, we will even talk about a little bit in the final class about what is the purpose and goals of Tantra or Vajrayana, and why is that practice, and what is the reason why you might want to practice it, and so forth. And then, I don't know, just sort of clean up and so forth. So that's sort of the main layout of the path. And if any of you bring up questions, of course, we can take detours. So let me see if there's any, okay. So we just have a thank you. So if there's no more questions, I'll sort of let you all go. I appreciate all of you taking the time to come and learn about this. And I hope I'm being clear. And my goal is to be as clear and as simple as I can. This stuff is vast and can be very complex, but I'm trying to sort of pick out the core key ideas and explain them as simply as I can. But I rely on you guys to ask me questions and stop me, when I get too abstruse or forget to explain a term or something. So anyway, I appreciate all of you coming. And if there's no more questions, I'll just go ahead and end, and I will see you next week from now.